What do most Fortune 500 executives have in common? They learned important lessons on the fields and courts of their high school and collegiate sports teams. This is true for both men and women. Ernst & Young found that a whopping 94% of women holding a C-suite position played sports. Their wins and losses shaped their habits and who they would become. Join me on my journey to sit with some of the brightest executives in the world as we discuss how sports shape their professional trajectory. In partnership with Chief Executive Magazine, the voice of America's CEO community. I'm your host, Don Yeager, and this is Corporate Competitor Podcast. With me for today's episode is Dan Cathy, chairman of one of the nation's largest family-owned businesses, Chick-fil-A. While a lot has changed in its nearly 70-year history, one principle remains paramount. Chick-fil-A is about people. And that is why Dan welcomes guests with a firm handshake and the greeting, "Hi, I'm Dan. I work in customer service." Dan has been defining his role in customer service for more than 40 years, even before officially joining Chick-fil-A in 1970. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce the athletic side of Dan that you may not know. As the eldest son of one of the most influential leaders of the last century, Dan has dedicated much of his life to building upon his father, S. Truett Cathy's vision to care for people by providing food and customer service that exceeds expectations.
An orchestra is a team. Not everybody plays the same instrument. You got the trumpet section, you got the oboes, trombones, you got the string section, and so forth. When we think about teams, we think about people that have unique skill sets in respective areas where we don't all have to be great at the same thing. Let's make sure we as leaders are really, really clear as to what we want that music to sound like. And let's select great people who want to perform the performance of their life by doing such a great job.
Dan, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Don. Honored to be with you here today. And I love all the athletic paraphernalia that you have behind you there. Looks like a very interesting office you have.
Yeah, a lifetime of doing this leads to a lot of little trinkets here and there, and then the occasional Shaquille O'Neal shoe.
Yeah, you need a Chick-fil-A Eat More Chicken Cow to add to your collection. I'll try to make that addition for your next podcast.
It will be there. Trust me. We'll put it up. That'd be awesome. You know, we all see Chick-fil-A today. We see what you, your father, your family have built. I love the stories that I have read about young Dan. Grew up in Georgia, spending lots of time in the Dwarf House, the original Chick-fil-A, singing for customers. I know you've got that great voice.
No, sir. No, please don't be confused. Let me just correct you for the record right there. I don't have a great voice, but that shouldn't keep us from singing.
I think you have a great voice.
I can carry a tune and I have a pretty good ear, but most of my musical interest primarily focused in on my trumpet later on. My mother was really a terrific performer. If there was America's Got Talent, she would have been a contender. She danced and she sang, and that attracted the attention of my father, quite frankly. They were only 8 years old when they met. And as we were coming along as young children, we'd do a lot of singing together. We learned how to sing in parts and do chords and so forth. And our little Dwarf Grill restaurant where the Chick-fil-A started was just a roadside diner. That's all it was. No Chick-fil-A on the menu at the time. It was hamburgers and ribeye steaks and icebox pies and shoestring French fries. My grandmother was the breadwinner for the family. She was a seamstress. She had these dorky looking dwarf costumes that we would dress up in, and we'd walk up to tables and we'd sing little songs, and we would be left with nickels and dimes and quarters as little tips that we received. I would say, guesstimate that in the 50s and 60s, half the adult population was smoking a cigarette. Before they'd walk in our little family restaurant, they'd throw their cigarettes on the ground. We had to sweep up a lot of cigarette butts. They would pop a piece of gum in their mouth to clear their palate of that nicotine and the taste of smoke so they could taste a delicious Dwarf House Dwarf burger and other steaks and so forth. That gum would end up underneath the seats and underneath the tables.
Ugh.
You'd have a whole rainbow of juicy fruit, Wrigley spearmint gum underneath that table. And being so short, as I still am today, but certainly back then as a 5, 6 year old, we could see more of the bottom of the table than the top of the table. So we were there with a little knife or even a fork. Don, of course, as you know, if you're cleaning gum out from underneath the table, if it gets a little stringy, you just let it sit there for another couple of days and harden up a little bit, and you can flick it off pretty easily.
You absolutely paid the price early. I love it. That work ethic and the time spent in the family restaurant, singing, delivering food, pulling gum off the table. The work ethic played its way into your athletic life as well. I spent some time looking at Woodward Academy. You were student body president, voted most loyal by your peers, and competed in 3 sports: track, cross country, and wrestling. In wrestling, 40 wins, 4 losses over your junior and senior year, enormous talent. Is there a memory from that window of time, a win, maybe even a loss, that you still think of today that you might not talk about or haven't talked about very often?
Great question. And it is something I don't talk about very often, but it is incredibly clear in my mind. The most disappointing experience in my life happened on a wrestling mat. My junior year, I had an undefeated season going into the regional tournament. I was the number 1 seed in the region tournament, pitted against the one that has the weakest record. Only the first and second place winners in the region tournament went on to the state championship. Unfortunately, I got the flu the week of the region tournament. It was just awful. I had gone to practice that week, but I'd had to kind of sit on the sideline because I was ill. We had a team doctor that gave me a lot of antibiotics and so forth. Went into that region tournament. There's 3 periods in wrestling. By the time that first period is over, I was completely exhausted. I went off that mat having lost, number 1 seed in the tournament, lost to the weakest wrestler in the region. I remember going back to the showers and I just stood there and I just cried my eyes out, just bawling. It was just awful. The sacrifices that I'd made. I'd come out of cross country. I'd cut 20 pounds to get down to the 109 weight class. I'll never forget it. And to add pain to suffering was the fact that the guy that won that state wrestling tournament in my weight class, I'd already beaten him one time that year
Ah,
in a dual meet match. And the guy that was placed second, I'd beaten him twice in dual meet competitions. Don, to be honest with you, I had a lot of ego. I was prideful. I was needed an attitude adjustment. I had to kind of reflect on that afterwards.
in some ways, was your identity caught up in that record and that accomplishment?
Oh, yes, in wrestling, it certainly was.
Yeah.
We ran track and cross country, and we were required to in order to be on our wrestling team. And we had a coach that was used to winning state championships.
Johnny Stallings?
Johnny Stallings, absolutely a huge mentor in my life, the biggest impact in my life during my teenage years, other than my dad. I went into that senior year with a much more sober and a much more respectful attitude toward my competition. My last match that I had was the thrill of victory, winning the state championship in the 119-pound weight class. I beat the defending state champion from the prior year by 1 point with 4 seconds to go. It's the single most exhilarating moment of my life. Nothing has ever even matched that moment. I threw my headgear up in the air, went behind the stands with my brother, and we just wept in each other's arms of the thrill of that moment.
Wow.
My brother was more excited for me than my parents were, I believe, and my coach. My brother had won the state championship the prior year with an undefeated record. Wrestling is interesting in that it's a very individual sport,
Mhm.
but it's at the same time a very team sport as well.
Right.
You don't become a region or state champion as a team unless you have a number of individual records that are going on.
You talked about Coach Stallings. I looked him up, studied a little bit about his, in fact, National Hall of Fame credentials. Share with me, if you would, a couple lessons you learned from him that you continue to use as a leader today.
Well, he was tough. He was really tough. He was demanding. We had to come in before school and run 2 miles before the day started. If we didn't get done then, we had to do it during lunch period. He convinced us, Don, that we would never step on that mat with a competitor that was in better physical condition than we were.
Mm.
It was like going to Camp Lejeune for the Marines. That was a sense of confidence, of readiness and competency that he instilled in us. We knew there's nobody that had worked harder than we had worked going into our competition. We've excelled competitively because we've had the work that we put into it. And he was the one that inspired that. Now, I like positive reinforcement, and he rarely ever gave us a real attaboy. When he did, huge.
Mm.
It was huge what it meant to you. He would sparingly give those, but when he did, it sure was well earned, and we knew it.
Right.
When we pursue our passions, we do the kinds of things that we have to do in order to be world class in what we do. We're benchmarking against world class competitors that are out there, others that we want to learn from. When others that look at it, they've not made the same commitment. They don't understand why you'd be so engrossed and so in head over heels in your pursuit of knowledge and your pursuit of curiosity. In food service and in hospitality, we were all in. I was bathed in this since I was a child. I got to see the incredible example of my dad about hospitality, graciousness, compassion over other people, on and on and on. That's so important. If we're going to be excellent at what we do, Don, we have to be all in. I certainly experienced that in wrestling, workouts before the school day started, running around our swimming pool that we had there at our school gym during lunchtime, the long, exhaustive workouts. I'd be just absolutely, completely exhausted and spent by the time I jumped in the car to come home. I learned what it meant to leave everything on that mat. Nothing was left over. I spent everything, complete exhaustion. And there's an exhilaration and a joy, Don, when you know you did your absolute very, very best. It's complete dedication. It was an incredible experience. I appreciate having this conversation with you just to kind of relive it, to be honest with you, because I don't do it consciously very often.
I love it. One thing that stands out in my reading about you, about your father, about the business is that you're not benchmarking yourself against another chicken sandwich joint. When you say you're benchmarking against the best, you're looking at Ritz-Carlton.
Yes,
Your industry is not as important to you as excellence.
absolutely. I think creativity and innovation to lead in any industry, the most valuable lessons that we learn are going to come from other related industries, not necessarily particularly the one that we're competing in. We're able to see innovation on technology, maybe robotics, maybe on media and branding activities that are going on in other industries that we can import into our own sphere, our own industry. We need to find opportunities to get up close and personal with people, if you will, that are at the top of their field in athletics and in business or in any field. Let's look for opportunities to be inspired by those that are true, really excellent in their field. It can be very encouraging, very challenging to us. We'll learn a lot. It'll elevate our game. It'll set the bar at a higher standard and gives us something really exciting to really pursue. As you mentioned, the Ritz Carlton, Horst Schulze, I'll never forget. He is the legendary founder of the DNA that we see today and a five-star luxury hotel chain like the Ritz Carlton. He was the genesis behind the expression, ladies and gentlemen, serving ladies and gentlemen. One day, 20 years ago, he said, Dan, you may be better than McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King, but you got nothing to be proud of. You're just the best of a bad lot. I don't mean to be overly critical of those other competitors that were there, but he was trying to make the point that we should all aspire to be outstanding in the next tier up. And he says, you need to be thinking about competing with the quality of service that you would have at a Ritz Carlton. If you brought that level of thinking, that level of hospitality back down to a $7 or $8 price point QSR quick service restaurant, man, you would really be differentiating yourself. It was because of that challenge that we decided that we wanted to differentiate Chick-fil-A against our competition. sustained competitive advantage if we could build it on the uniqueness of the quality of the service that was built on a Ritz-Carlton platform. So we went to fresh flowers in all our restaurants. We put pepper grinders in all our restaurants. You'd never see that at another QSR kind of brand. And we even upgraded our service in the dining room from a janitorial service to more of a host and hostess style service. We had to pay more. We had to train better. We had to reinstill a better language system about the expression "my pleasure" versus "yeah, no problem," those sorts of things. Doing so, though, paid huge dividends, Don, that people are more hungry to be treated with honor, dignity, and respect. As delicious as our Chick-fil-A sandwiches are, our fresh squeezed lemonade, and those hot waffle fries, they're in greater need of being restored and encouraged from an emotional standpoint. I love the term restaurant. It's a French word. It means a place of restoration.
Mm.
When we have these poignant conversations with thoughtful leaders that inspire us and challenge us, they will always take us to a place that we've never been before. My whole view of our business, our industry, really our ministry to society was dramatically elevated just in that one definition that we're here to help restore people's lives. They're in difficult circumstances. They've got challenges going on at home, challenges going on at school, challenges going on at work. But when they come for that Chick-fil-A drive-through or walk in our restaurant, we have an opportunity to give them a word of encouragement and positive affirmation. That's what we learn when we hang out with thought leaders, people that are really outstanding in their respective fields.
My pleasure is my favorite part of going to Chick-fil-A. You're right. When the young person sitting at the cash register says those words to me, boy, you and I had the honor of being together in a room with our mutual friend, John Maxwell, to celebrate his 75th birthday. You got to play your trumpet. It was pretty awesome. You also had a line that I scribbled down immediately. I went looking for a pen. I had not heard you say this before. I'm sure you have. You say you look at Chick-fil-A as a leadership organization disguised as a restaurant, teaching leadership skills to all of those who are in your company. You don't see yourself as what you serve, you see yourself as what you want to serve.
Yes.
Talk to me about that because this seems to flow with your desire to constantly be in the presence of the best. Where does that come from?
Well, in a growing organization, it's all about leadership development, grooming and nurturing. In fact, John Maxwell, I love this quote, success is about succession.
Mhm.
We have to be constantly be thinking about who's in the pipeline. Any sports team always has a farm system. The varsity team has a junior varsity that's part of the farm system. Other professional sports, of course, have farm teams scattered around where they're nurturing and building a system of character development, skill development, leadership development. About 70% of our Chick-fil-A restaurant operators came from the ranks of our hourly team members. We are constantly grooming and nurturing. That's why we have to be aligned with wonderful, inspiring people like John Maxwell,
Mhm.
Marcus Buckingham,
Mhm.
Jim Collins, that have been part of the academic faculty in this leadership development discussion. Where we've had these people at our annual conventions that we have to inspire us, to motivate us, to help us be aware of how important it is that we pour into the next generation, that we tell stories. It's the old campfire deal where we sit around, we tell stories. There's a lot of institutional knowledge that has to be very intentionally choreographed into our schedules. We're sharing, we're intentionally focusing, teaching, but we're also embodying those values, Don. It's not just the words that we say, but that our life is a showcase of principles built on integrity, built on honesty, compassion, and a spirit of humility, a spirit of gratefulness and gratitude to those that are around us. And those are the values that have to be poured out and exemplified for others.
Your father is a legend, written multiple books. People want to know how he was able to be so principally to the idea we're not going to be open on Sundays. Our lemonade will be at this standard. We're not going to shrink standards in order to raise profit margins. Everything about it stood out. And then he hands the reins to you. There is no success without succession. A few months ago, you and I were talking about this. You actually encouraged me to go out and buy a book around the idea, one of the challenges that happens when people are handed succession opportunities. The easy road is the leader's gone. Now maybe we could make some of those adjustments that they wouldn't because of their principles. You didn't just stick to the principles, you grew them. How difficult was it in that transition from your father and now to your son?
The best illustration that I think of is the passing of the baton. I had opportunity of interviewing the track coach for U.S. Track and Field out of Denver, Colorado Springs, and coach told me, Dan, you've got to realize that it's not the four fastest runners that runs the relay race. Well, that kind of caught me by surprise. I thought, well, golly, if you got the, four fastest runners, they're going to run that relay race every time. He said, no, sir. He said, it's the team that gets the baton around the track first wins the race. So if you have a fumbling of the passing of the baton, no matter how fast the runners are, you're not going to win that relay race against another set of competitors that may not be quite as fast, but they do such a beautiful job of passing the baton. The really great baton exchanges, the objective is to make it a non-event, that there's such a seamless transition, such alignment in the values and the principles from one person to the next, that it doesn't represent a big blimp on the radar screen for the organization. There's not a big jump in the road. There's not a dramatic change or swerve in the culture of the organization, but there's a tremendous amount of continuity about the things that do not need to change. We have to balance the things that we have to change to stay relevant, and then the things that have to stay the same. Someone said the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. There are some elements about our culture, society, human development that will never change. And we can go back and read the classic lessons that will never change about humanity. But there also is the equal ambition to keep things very relevant, given the changing dynamics of our culture and society, driven by technology and globalization and many other factors that are there. We have to have the courage to change the things that need to change, and also to have the strength to maintain the principles that are timeless. And we have to have a good, strong grip on both of those at the same time. I love what Jim Collins, I believe, said: when the rate of change exceeds the rate of internal change, disaster is imminent.
Mm.
So we have this dual sense of responsibility, this tension that we manage in leadership to stay very relevant, but at the same time, stay very grounded in the fundamentals. At Chick-fil-A, we're very grounded on our Chick-fil-A corporate purpose to be a purpose-driven organization. That purpose is defined in this statement that we're here to glorify God by being a faithful steward of all that's entrusted to us, and to have a positive influence on all who come in contact with Chick-fil-A. We want to impact people's lives. We want to be a good steward of what we've been entrusted with. We're not going to take any of this with us. We only have it for just a moment in time. So let's be a good steward of it. And then ultimately, let's acknowledge our Creator. Let's have a sense of humility. Let's have a teachable spirit. Let's be willing to be submissive, all of which we learn in our faith experience to honor the Lord and seek to honor Him in all that we do. That's the baton exchange for society, for culture, for a business, for an enterprise.
I was speaking at an event a couple of years ago at West Point in which the conversation was around one of the challenges in American industry at a high level right now of succession, how few organizations building at a macro level had internal successors. They were bringing in people from outside to take over and move the organization forward, ostensibly. The way that you all have managed it, your father to you to your son, is there a lesson you can teach us as business leaders about how do we make sure that we are constantly thinking about internally focused succession and making sure that we're doing the right thing constantly?
A very practical thing, Don, that I would say is simply avoid situations where you're by yourself on a learning adventure. Make sure you take people with you. A leader should never go anywhere by themselves and forfeit the opportunity of sharing the knowledge, the learning that can be gained by being well traveled. I chided someone just yesterday. This is an individual that made a exploratory visit to another organization. I know it's going to be a very rich learning opportunity. And I coached, I should say, maybe that individual to really optimize that opportunity. Why didn't you bring somebody with you? If you go and you get excited about what you're going to see, I can have the vocabulary of Shakespeare and I'd never be able to replicate how powerful or dramatic that experience may have been. I was at a conference well back in my 20s when a gentleman was speaking. He said, I don't even go to the airport without bringing somebody else with me that I can be constantly pouring into. Let's just don't miss that opportunity. Conversations, trips, learning adventures that we can be on. Let's make sure that we got a couple of other people that are part of that journey with us.
And so, in some ways, your father included you in his journey. And I assume you've done the same with Andrew over time so that the baton pass wasn't a dramatic experience. It was barely a blip.
Yes. And the nature of the baton, Don, is multidimensional. One baton pass has to do with the ownership of the enterprise. Another baton relates to the operational elements of the enterprise. If you're in a family business, for instance, you may or may not have a successor that moves into the operational leadership of the business. But if it stays privately held, it will always stay in the family. You don't have a vote on that. If God calls you to be involved in the leadership of the business, actively involved, that's one thing. But you really don't have a choice about your responsibilities as an owner. We try to be very nurturing of the business acumen among our Cathy family. But then there could be a small segment of the population of the family business that actually has the skills and the acumen and the work ethic and on to actually serve as a leader in the business.
Mm.
And it's incredibly wonderful when that happened. And I was so very fortunate that my oldest son, Andrew, had the acumen, the desire, the passion, the calling in life to succeed me in that CEO role. I love what the great human philosopher Steve Harvey says about this. I actually heard him say this in a John Maxwell interview.
Yeah.
John is talking to Steve, and Steve says, your career is what you're paid for, but your calling is what you're made for.
Mm.
Oftentimes, we are very consciously aware of our career, but we don't pay as much attention consciously to being aware. What's my calling in life? What's the unique thing of experiences, temperament, education, on and on and on, my life's journey that can give me some sense of direction of how God had prepared me for what I'm to do with my life.
Mm.
Has my life changed or has my purpose changed? I think it's evolved. I really enjoy and I feel like God has equipped me to create environments where people can thrive. We were able to do that at Chick-fil-A, our corporate campus. The culture that's there is an environment where people thrive. There's a lot of upward mobility in Chick-fil-A. We have a 98% retention rate among our corporate staff and our restaurant operators. People come there and they thrive there. Our name is the last name on their resume. They decide to either die or retire while being at Chick-fil-A. And I credit that in some part to the fact that we've designed a incredibly beautiful place, the physical place that people operate in. There's no delayed maintenance at Chick-fil-A. There are no potholes in our parking lots. We have up-to-date equipment and technology business systems that enable people to fly through that drive-through at astounding rates. It's placemaking, it's investment, great engineering, great design, great architecture that goes into our enterprise. And I love, as I look back over my life, I define it in that way that I would not have even 10 years ago. And I'm enjoying bringing those skills to new environments, new settings, including our movie studio operation here at Trillis Studios, from which I'm doing this podcast.
Which is incredible. A couple questions that we've asked several guests recently explores the concept of momentum. In athletics, we believe we can see or feel momentum shifts But it's true in business too. You can sense when you identified a couple of pivot points, the conversation with Horst about your don't just be happy with being a great contributor in this space, be better. That's a moment that became a momentum shift for you.
Yes. Leaders set the tone for that. They have to be purpose driven. They have to have a positive, affirming overall demeanor about life that sees life as an adventure.
Mm.
They have to live an exciting life, a enjoyable life. They have to live a very disciplined life in order to sustain that over a long period of time. It helps in recruiting people and talent to want to be a part of a growing organization. There's a natural talent magnet component about a growing, thriving enterprise. You just make sure you keep doing the things that got you where you are. Don't get complacent. Don't sit back on your laurels. Don't take things for granted. Keep your work ethic up. Keep those personal disciplines that you've had in the past going that sustain great performance. I think of those in four buckets: mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Mentally, am I still a student? Am I still learning? Am I still curious? What am I doing to maintain that sense of positive view of life? Emotionally, am I taking care of relationships and marriage? Am I taking care of relationships in my family that gives me that strength emotionally to withstand challenges? Am I staying in shape physically? I have a direct correlation between stepping on the scales and how sharp I am mentally.
Mhm.
I stepped on the scales at 152.7 this morning. 153, I'm over the mark. No dessert today for me. I know exactly where that needs to be, and I measure it. And that's an important part of discipline, is having good measurement systems. I'm equally attentive to the spiritual health that we all have. That's the deepest part of where we're at. What are we doing to nurture that?
Mhm.
All of those are important as we think about leadership, setting the tone, setting the pace for positive momentum for the business that can be sustained over a long period of time. And that's what you want to do. You want to keep that positive mindset. You want to have a winning record and sustain it. We see the great coaches.
One feeds the other.
Yeah, they're a farm system for all the other coaches that come out of their programs.
Yeah. I think one of the most overused words in business today is the word team. You guys are in a class of your own, but many places say, well, me and my team, or I'm going to get my team to follow me to do this. What they really are is a group of individual contributors that happen to have the same business card. They're not a team. You've experienced teams. You know what it means to cross that bridge and actually find a sense of purpose and chase something collectively. What advice would you give to a young leader trying to take a group of individuals and meld them into a team?
Well, let's move to music for just a moment. Think about a symphony orchestra.
Okay.
An orchestra is a team. Not everybody plays the same instrument.
Mhm.
You got the trumpet section, you got the oboes, trombones, you got the string section, and so forth. When we think about teams, we think about people that have unique skill sets in respective areas where we don't all have to be great at the same thing. When we staff a team, we put a team together, we learn to populate it with incredibly gifted people who are outstanding in their field. But why do they work together? They work together because there's a conductor at the front of the room that's got a score, it's got a baton in their hand, and they realize that if they could sync everybody up, if they could all play off the same piece of music, if they could follow the notes that have been scripted out and so forth, they can create an incredibly beautiful experience by all of being together. Great orchestras are reading off a score led by a conductor. The genesis is that of a composer that wrote all the notes. It's the composer that was the first one to hear the music between their ears. My challenge that I have is to make sure that I never dummy down the music to fit the orchestra, but that I upgrade the orchestra and the talent to play the music, that I don't go from 16th notes to quarter notes just because of who's sitting in the orchestra. As leaders, be incredibly clear of the music that you want to hear. Oftentimes we miss the mark as leaders because we're not as crystal clear. My dad said, I want people to hear my pleasure when they say thank you. He had to drill that into us for 10 years. It was crystal clear in his mind. He never wavered in that. We actually picked up the sound bites and the video clips of him saying that 10 consecutive years. Let's make sure we as leaders are really, really clear as to what we want that music to sound like. And let's select great people who want to perform the performance of their life by doing such a great job.
Dan Cathy, I loved today's conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as well. But I have to tell you, it means so much when we want to learn from the best, when we get the best to come take time to teach us. I cannot thank you enough for today joining us and being a corporate competitor.
Don, my pleasure.
That was inspiring. I am more in love with his organization today than I was an hour ago. I was taken right off the bat by how absolute he was that sports had played a great role in the development of the leader that he would become. That the most disappointing and the most enjoyable moment of his life, he can name them both. They both occurred on a wrestling mat when he had an opportunity to compete at the highest level. He had a great mentor as a coach who taught him that if we can constantly be in better condition, better shape than anybody else, that will always be our competitive advantage. As they built out Chick-fil-A restaurants, he wanted to make sure that they had no delayed maintenance, no potholes in their parking lot. That is their version of constantly being ready, just as the coach had encouraged them. I thought it was really important when he talked about benchmarking, not against your direct competitors, but against the best in class that you could find, how it impacted him, how it led to pepper grinders and fresh flowers, but more importantly, just an approach. How do we want to be different, not against our competitor, but against a standard far greater than what our competitors even considering? The whole my pleasure philosophy that his father really forced upon the organization. Those words, my pleasure, stand out today. I cannot wait to hear him every time I go by a Chick-fil-A. And then finally, I loved his discussion around you should avoid setting out on a learning adventure by yourself. That if you are working to grow yourself, your company, bring someone along with you because the journey will just straight be better. As delicious as Chick-fil-A sandwiches are, the people that come through the door are in greater need of being encouraged. That's why words like my pleasure matter so. Leaders are repeaters, and his father had to repeat those words for 10 years before everyone in the organization adopted the language. It was today a highlight in our work in the development of this podcast to have Dan Cathy with us. We are all better for having had Dan Cathy in our conversation today. I know my team will be better because of what I learned and the notes that I took. In fact, those notes will be available in the show notes for episode 112. Let's all go out today and become corporate competitors. If you could share one habit, one thing you've done consistently that allowed you to separate yourself from your competitors, what would it be? In my 30-year career, 2,500 of the greatest athletes, coaches, and leaders answered that question for me.
This is Don Yeager, who did that article I was telling you about.
Don, Dave Sims with Coach K. How you doing?
Hey, Don. How you doing, my man? Great, sir.
What they gave to me is what I'm giving to you in my online course, Journey to Greatness. Through engaging storytelling and on-demand videos, you will learn the 16 habits that will jumpstart your personal growth. I will instruct you on how to apply these winning characteristics to your life through custom workbook exercises. We are slashing the price for our podcast listeners. Lifetime access to Journey to Greatness is normally $399, but for our podcast listeners, it will be $49 with the code podcast at checkout. Click the banner on corporatecompetitorpodcast.com to enroll. Thanks for listening to the show. I would be so grateful if you left us a rating and a review. We will be rolling out a new episode every Wednesday. To be the first to listen, subscribe to the podcast on our website, corporatecompetitorpodcast.com. Plus, as a thank you gift, you will receive a free chapter from one of my best-selling books on the habits of high-performing teams. Stay in touch by connecting with me on social media at Don Yeager, Yaeger, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Until next week, I appreciate you.